evening and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on 24th Feb 2022 to 31st May 2025. More than 13,000 Ukrainian civilians have lost their lives, including 710 children, according to a report by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The war in Ukraine continues to inflict devastating consequences on millions of lives, and despite ongoing international efforts, the humanitarian situation remains dire. Joining me today from Washington, D.C. to shed light on the evolving humanitarian crisis is Ms. Elina Beketova, a fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and the author of Behind the Lines, a publication that provides analysis of key developments in Ukraine's temporarily occupied and recently liberated territories. For anyone interested in exploring this topic, you can find the link to Behind the Lines in the description box below, so do check it out. Thank you so much, Elina, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Ritvich, thank you so much for doing what you're doing, and thank you for the immense support of Ukraine.
So I would like to begin the conversation by asking that, from a humanitarian standpoint, what are some of the most urgent challenges faced by Ukrainian civilians living under Russian occupation, and how do these reflect like broader efforts to undermine Ukrainian statehood and societal cohesion?
So, from the humanitarian standpoint, and I think it's a very important question, according to the Ukrainian government, there are approximately 6 million Ukrainians, including 1.5 million children, who are still living under Russian occupation. I think it's important to understand how many people are still living there. For context, that's about the entire population of Norway or 20 other European countries. This is the territory currently controlled, unfortunately, by the Russian forces. Or this is, for instance, the US state of Colorado. So people are suffering whether they stay or flee. If they leave, they often lose their property and may never return to this territory. If they stay, they face Russification, militarization, and identity erasure. So, what are the urgent challenges? I think that the urgent challenges currently it's all types of violations of the rights that you may possibly think of. The Russian Federation does everything possible and impossible to just erase the Ukrainian identity. So there is forced passportization and legal traps. So residents are forced to obtain Russian documents to survive in order to access healthcare, education, property rights. And one of the latest documents that I saw, it's Vladimir Putin's March 2024 decree that requires Ukrainians without legal status to either leave by September 10th of this year or to obtain the Russian passport. When people obtain this passport, they are the subjects to all the Russian laws. So, for instance, they can be illegible even for the conscription into the Russian army. Imagine the Ukrainian living in the temporarily occupied territory that is currently controlled by Russia can be conscripted into the Russian army and basically fight against their own people. Or it's when the person obtains this Russian passport, then it makes it possible for Russian forces to accuse this person of anything. It can be, the latest example is like 19 years old woman from Kherson sentenced to 9 years for allegedly spying for Ukraine after being forced to get a Russian passport. So when they give these passports, all the people are subjects to all the Russian laws, and then Russian forces can do whatever if they consider this person is disloyal to their regime. So, as I have said, there are multiple violations of all types of human rights, and the very important process that is happening right now is the Russification programs, the militarization of education. So it's all types of military-style training, propaganda field summer camps, or Russian curriculums, and so-called university exchanges between Russia and temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories that are currently occupied by Russia. So we see all types of indoctrination programs for youth. But I don't want to, talk a lot about that because, as you have said, thank you so much for the advertisement of Behind the Lines. If anyone is willing to learn more about that, there is Behind the Lines tracker, where I basically check all types of Telegram channels of the Russian forces or Ukrainian Telegram channels that are focusing on temporarily occupied territories, where I put all the examples of Russification, militarization of education, and all type of indoctrination programs. I think it's very important because we have to understand one thing: when Russian forces are influences or are trying to influence the adult people, and the other thing is basically when they're indoctrinating the young population, because it will have the consequences.
Yeah, so how has the destruction and militarization of essential infrastructure like healthcare, water, and food supply, except from the social media, have been used as a tool of coercion by occupying forces? And what innovative humanitarian responses have emerged to uphold the dignity and survival of the affected Ukrainians?
Well, unfortunately, there is very little Ukraine can do right now to help civilians in the temporarily occupied territories. These areas are cut off and humanitarian access is severely restricted. Until 2023, some people with Ukrainian passports could still access limited medical care, even surgeries in occupied areas, but now there is no longer possible because without a Russian passport, you can't get an insurance, and without the Russian insurance, it is not possible to get any medical help. So that's the reality. And that's exactly how the occupation forces use essential services as leverage, forcing people to accept Russian documents just to survive. Water infrastructure is also heavily affected, especially near the frontline cities. Entire systems have been destroyed by shelling or deliberately shut down. And this isn't just isolated, it's happening across occupied regions. Food supplies are militarized too. Distribution is often handled through pro Russian local administrations. Aid is used as a loyalty test. If you're seen as disloyal, you may simply be denied help. The bottom line here, unfortunately, is grim. Russia is using access to healthcare, food, and water as a weapon of control, a way to break people's will and force them into submission. This is unfortunately the reality of the occupied territories.
Yeah, so in a context where Russian forces often weaponizes humanitarian aid for political gain, how can international actors effectively uphold the principles of impartiality and ensure that aid reaches Ukrainians in need without legitimizing occupation?
So, Ritvij, thank you so much for this question. That's a very tough but very important question. We all want aid to reach people who need it. But in occupied parts of Ukraine, Russia often turns aid into a tool of control, as you basically say. You only get help if you take a Russian passport. If you're seen as disloyal, you might be denied food, water, or medical care. So, how can the international community respond without playing into that system? First, we need to support local Ukrainian civil society. There are people who still operate underground, who can have, friends or communities that are in the temporarily occupied territories, but they can still help those people who are in the temporarily occupied territories. It's extremely hard, and sometimes. People have to risk a lot because they have to go to these occupied territories, but they're still able to help. But it's very interesting because if it's there should be careful not to legitimize the occupation, because if there is no flashy partnerships or programs that make it look like the occupiers are official authorities, aid must be neutral, and other European countries can do it. But it's just the problem with it. It's simply they can't get the access to these territories. So that is why they have to definitely collaborate with the Ukrainian government, with Ukrainian civil society, and NGOs that still have some ties with temporarily occupied territories, even though it's extremely hard. But at the end of the day, being neutral doesn't mean being blind. Our job is to protect people, not to make the occupiers' job easier. So we need to be smart, careful, and above all, focused on the dignity and survival of Ukrainians. So if there is any way that the NGO in Europe can collaborate with the Ukrainian NGO who still have ties with the temporarily occupied territories, they still have to try to help, even though it is extremely complicated.
Yeah, so coming to international actors, so how do you see the support from European Union, United States government, and UK government in the whole scenario? Because these three states have been a historic supporter of the Ukrainian cause.
Right, that's correct, and you would probably hear it everywhere that Ukraine considers European countries and the United States as their biggest allies, and in many cases, the survival of Ukraine is would be not possible without many countries who are helping on the ground, but there is still a lot to be done because if you're asking me about what types of sanction work might be possible, I would reply to you that yes, there is still a lot to be done because we should understand on real we should access and we should acknowledge the real accountability. First, sanction the people enabling the occupation. For instance, those deporting Ukrainian children, running sham administration, and operating filtration camps, because this is what we're talking about. The filtration camps are possible in the 21st century, and Ukrainians having tattoos or having someone in the armed forces of Ukraine can be detained simply for having relatives in the armed forces of Ukraine. This is what filtration camps are all about. But these aren't, it's possible to know all their names, and they are all part of the machinery of the war crimes. Second, it's important to close the loopholes because Russia still gets Western tech and goods through countries. So we need secondary sanctions to stop that. Third, support justice efforts because both international, like the International Criminal Court, and Ukrainian-led investigations, because Ukraine has enough evidence. What it needs is global legal and political backing. And finally, it's important to expose the perpetrators because naming names actually does work because Russian elites care about their assets and their image. Public pressure matters because sometimes their property is not in Russia, but in very decent European countries, and they have their properties there. They have people who work for them over there. So it's important to see this chain and to actually stop it. And in short, if there is no justice, there will be no lasting peace. And we understand that Ukraine gets a lot of support from its allies, but a lot needs to be done. Sanctions and legal action are tools, not just for punishment, but for protecting civilians and defending the values we all believe in.
Yeah. So now coming to the occupied territories and about children specifically. So which groups within the occupied territories, such as children, displaced persons, and ethnic minorities, face the most severe humanitarian risk, and how can the targeted interventions reinforce their protection amid ongoing aggression? And I would like you to specifically talk about children, if
Yeah.
that is yeah.
Yeah, Ritvich, thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, I was thinking, right now that we have more than 20,000 Ukrainian children with names, with last names who were abducted and whose parents can't get them back. And this is the reality of today. There is the Children of the War website, and if you want to learn more information, I can provide it to you. But unfortunately, all civilians that you have just listed are at risk. So children, they're one of the most vulnerable groups and also one of the most targeted. Thousands have been taken to Russia or Russian-controlled areas. Their names were changed. So that is why when their relatives are trying to learn the information where they are located, they can't locate them because Russians have already changed their names. Then they have been taken to Russia or Russian-controlled areas, sometimes under the level of evacuation or protection. But for some reason, Russian forces don't want to return them to the Ukrainian-controlled territory, which is safe, which raises many questions. What was that? And that was a real abduction. In reality, many are cut off from their families and told they're now Russian citizens. Others still in occupied areas, and they're being exposed to propaganda, military training, and forced Russification. Their entire identity is under attack, and that can have, unfortunately, lifelong consequences. Second, internally displaced people and those who tried to flee. If they return to occupied territory, they might not even, some people who are on the temporarily occupied territories, they're afraid to leave this territory because they're afraid that they won't go through the filtration procedure. But some people are trying to come back to the temporarily occupied territories. For instance, if they have their, property there or seek, relatives or whoever, they might go through filtration procedure, and they can be even detained if Russian forces consider them disloyal. And third, ethnic minorities. For instance, if we're talking about Crimean Tatars, they have been in Crimea, they have faced repression since 2014, the illegal annexation. And now, with the full scale invasion, surveillance, forced conscription, political arrests have only gotten worse. Many Crimean Tatars are being labeled as extremists just for trying to preserve their language, religion, or history. So, how can we, the international community, protect them? Well, first, by keeping them visible. Ritvich, your work is absolutely amazing and brilliant because you are talking with Ukrainians and you give them the voice, and many of them are able to talk about the problems and violations of the law that are on the temporarily occupied territories, for example, right? So this is important because we need to learn more about those people who are still staying on these temporarily occupied territories. Then we need to invest in targeted support. It means creating safe pathways for education, psychological support, and legal aid, especially for youth and displaced families. And third, we need to collect and preserve evidence. Documentation of what's happening now is key for future justice and accountability. And you know that many Ukrainian representatives and organizations are working on that. So the aggression is ongoing, but so is the resistance. So protection isn't just about physical safety, it's about defending identity, dignity, and the right to exist as who you are. And this is very important because you give the opportunity for many people from these territories to speak or to talk about the violations that exist on these territories.
Yeah, now coming to the work which you do and behind the lines. So, talking about militarization of the education and Russification programs. So, I mean, what are some of the key insights that you want to share regarding this?
Well, unfortunately, it's just if you look at it, it's every day something is going on. But the main damage, as I think, is to Ukrainian identity of kids who live on this territory. Imagine some of them are they have lived only in the occupation, so they don't know what it means to live in the free Ukraine. Because many of them who live, for instance, in Crimea or Donetsk or Lugansk Oblast, where hostilities started in 2014-15, they basically are 10 years old right now, and they didn't know another Ukraine because they were told that they're living in self-proclaimed republics or in Russia. So, which means that it has a consequence on them. They have only Russian curriculum, so they have only the Russian perception of this war. So they are given the textbooks where it said that Ukraine is allegedly that, and that is why Russia came to save and rescue them from whatever people. So they have the distorted reality, they have the fake reality of the world, which is given to them by Russian forces, and this is the reality where they have to live. And there are many interviews with the teenagers who fled these territories, and they tell that they still would learn. They would still have like the online classes and learn Ukrainian language. And this is something that would help them if they decided to flee this territory. Then they come to the Ukraine-controlled territory and they know the language, just simply because they had additional curriculum, additional classes in Ukrainian language that helped them to preserve their identity. In these territories, in temporarily occupied, living in occupation means that you cannot preserve your identity. You cannot be who you are, and this is the most severe damage that is that is inflicted on anyone's personality. Because when a person cannot be the person who he or she is, it has a lot of consequences. So basically, they're given the distorted reality, all types of camps, militarized camps where people are shown where kids or teenagers are shown how to assemble and disassemble the weapon, or how to work with the drone or whatever. So it's all militarization and making them believe that Ukraine is their enemy country, and this is the really bad consequence. And that is why I think that other European countries have to think about how they can bring kids or children from temporarily occupied territories and show them another world, show them that everything that they was told or taught in this whatever fake classes is not the reality. That the world is open. That Ukraine is this country where they are supposed to live. It's just Russia came there, invaded, and started changing their identity. So this is unfortunately the biggest consequence. But if you want to if you want to read in details what is happening there, please do visit Behind the Lines tracker and choose there the category Russification or propaganda, and you can see what types of classes Russian forces create so that to change these identities of kids or teenagers who are very flexible. And in this, age, you're very flexible and you're eager to learn something new. And if you're shown or taught a very fake information, this is what you have to deal with for the rest of your life.
Yeah. So, what is the Ukrainian government doing at the government level, as well as the Ukrainian citizens at the public policy and, civil society level in order to counter those misinformation and disinformation? And what is this adaptive frameworks that is being employed by the Ukrainian government in order to tackle all of these scenarios?
Vivich, thank you so much. It's a very important question. And there are a lot of public discussions. There are a lot of NGO and nonprofit organizations who work exactly with this topic. But basically, the main question, and this is the main problem that Ukrainian government and representatives have, is that they don't have the access to those territories. So we understand that if we have the isolated territory somewhere, it's only when people have their friends or their relatives who they can talk with. And this actually, in many cases, people are afraid if they are living in the temporarily occupied territories. They're afraid to talk with their relatives in the free territory, in the Ukraine-controlled territory, because they are afraid to be detained for something. You never know why you can be detained. So that is why the main thing is to still maintain these channels of communication and just to talk. And unfortunately, it's not possible. Like there are Ukrainian channels and they are available, but for that, every person has to have VPN or safer way to access different websites. It's very hard to do. The main thing, unfortunately, if Ukrainians were given the means to liberate these territories, then there are strategies how to reintegrate people living on these territories. But for that, there should be this main thing. Ukrainians should be given this chance to liberate these territories. Then they will be able to test and to maintain everything that they have in strategies. Because right now we're talking about that there are like separate groups who are working on reintegration, for instance, of Mariupol. There are separate groups who are working on reintegration of Crimea. There are courses even to for preparation of public servants who want to go and work in Crimea when Ukraine will regain control over the peninsula. So there is a lot going on right now, but there is uh, Ukrainians don't have the main thing right now. They don't have the access to these territories. That is why they can't test and implement their strategies. But right now they're working hard to have these strategies when the moment is right and when they will have the opportunity to actually get there. Unfortunately, everything that is going on right now is not to lose the connection with this territory, not to lose the connection with people there, and still have very small, but at least some connection with these territories. Right now, we're talking about that because we don't have the main thing, the access.
Yeah. And how do you see the role of international institutions as well as universities worldwide in order to, have frameworks to countering such disinformation campaigns?
Well, I think there is nothing that the civilized world, there is very little that the civilized world can work with. Because if the civilized world could, come and say about those things to the temporarily occupied territories, then it will be clear that people will hear them. But um, like universities or researchers that live in other countries of the world, they can definitely stay in touch with if they ever have connection with people from temporarily occupied territories and these people want to go and study somewhere abroad. I think Ukrainian universities and European universities have to have programs for those people because it's the opportunity for them to um, to live in a different world. Because if they stay on this temporarily occupied isolated territory, it means that they have only one way, and this way is with Russia. This way is only Russian world mentality. But if they can have an opportunity to be, inserted in some type of conversations, or if they can have an opportunity to study somewhere abroad, or if they can have an opportunity to have a program somewhere abroad. I think it will give them the chance to at least learn how the world is built right now, and what's the main things right now. There is, unfortunately, I'm telling you because I'm researching this topic, but we all can think about reintegration, all, I mean, academia, researchers, people from other countries. But if we don't have the access to this territory, then there is little we can do. But we also have to think about it, how we can reintegrate those people, and we have to maybe have a working group, international working group, and think about other countries in the world that were potentially occupied. Part was occupied, part was not. Was a free country, and what was the right strategies for different countries. We should Ukrainians should try to find their model, because I'm sure that the model of many countries won't fit for Ukraine, but I'm sure we should talk at least about that. What is the model or strategies that might work for Ukrainians who are basically living right now, where we have the free country and we want the whole country to be free, but the temporarily occupied territory is the isolated piece of land. So how can we reintegrate those people? And this is, the main thing is that whenever I read about different strategies, I see how there is a big desire to reintegrate people, because when we talk about territories, we all understand it's just people, how we can all reintegrate them and how we can all work and heal this trauma.
Yeah. So, now coming to the idea of converting thought leadership into impact. So, there has been a lot of thought leadership. There has been a lot of things that has been said about, how to help Ukraine in general. But do you think all of those thought leadership is converting into some actionable insights and impacts on the ground? How do you track the progress?
Well, Ritvij, I'm observing one thing, and I will share it with you. I don't know how to. I will try to put it into words. There is a lot that is being done right now, and it's very important that many countries are working. We have so many working groups. We have so many people working how to help Ukraine, right? But we used to have the case. If you remember, in autumn 2022, when Ukrainians had enough weapons and means, they could liberate Kherson and Kharkiv. It's in the eastern part of Ukraine. So when Ukrainians have enough weapons, then they can then they can surprise the whole world, because they can liberate it. But right now, what we're seeing is that people are some people are tired of the war. Some people, there is this war fatigue, right? Some people have just come to an idea that this war is something that Ukraine will be dealing for whatever, like allegedly it's a protracted war. And I think it's a trap, because we should think about mechanisms that can help Ukraine right now. We don't have to get used to the war, because when people get used to the war, then there is the possibility that the aggressor state goes further. So I remember the same feeling with Crimea. After the annexation of Crimea, people would talk about Crimea for several years, and then there was nothing. So people kind of got used to the idea, oh, Crimea is occupied, annexed, blah, 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 and they forgot about that. So this is the main trap. When we have this thing, when people get used, and when political leaders and the prominent people of this world get used to the idea that Ukraine has allegedly the protracted war, then the aggressor state goes further. So that is why we should do everything possible and impossible to keep the topic. And Ukrainians are doing their job, because right now they are turning their country into the fortress country. So they have, the European Union and NATO aspirations in the constitution, in the preamble, but everyone understands it will take years, to get there. But it doesn't mean that Ukrainians are just sitting still and not doing anything, because they are rebuilding their country. They are turning their country into a fortress, because they understand that this threat from the Russian Federation will exist there, and they don't know when the war will be over. But if you speak with a person who lives in Kiev or in Kharkiv or in any other city, people understand that they are tired, but they don't want to be occupied. That is why, if you have the option to be occupied or to fight, this is what you will choose to fight, because you don't want to be occupied. So this is the main mentality that Ukrainian people have, and I think this is the mentality that the world leaders and other allies, European and American, should have, that if Ukrainians stop fighting, they will be occupied. That's simple as it is. And then we can, do other stuff. We will understand Ukraine will be able to liberate their territories when they have enough means. We don't know when it will happen, but there will be one day when it happens. And then all the strategies to reintegrate will happen. But right now, the main thing is not to let the political leaders and the leaders of the world to think that this is allegedly the protracted war, because we see that Ukrainians are doing a lot to change their country, to change their mentality, and because they don't want to be occupied.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elina, for your time. Really hope the situation gets better or at least gets on the track where the rights and the freedom of Ukrainian civilians can be upheld. Thank you so much once again for sharing the detailed analysis. And I really urge our viewers to go and check out the work by Elina through Behind the Lines, and looking forward to continuing this coverage on
Really,
here.
thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for your brilliant work.
Thank you so much once again.